It's time for Chess Chest!
What?
No.
Chess chest.
Welcome to another Down the Rabbit Hole video, and welcome to another episode of Chess Chest. I really enjoy this game. I have enjoyed talking about all the different bits so far, so we're going to keep going. And we now are going to talk about these fellas on the back row because they're kind of interesting. So we'll sort of start out on the outer edges with a piece that is very strange and very powerful. The Rook. Why does a piece that has the name of a crow move like a bulldozer and wipe out the enemy and also look like a castle? This guy's really got an interesting history and in fact was the most powerful piece on the board other than the king until about the 15th century when the queen a lot of the movements for her were changed around and she became the most powerful piece. There was a time when if you were similar to if you're about to put the king into check, you warn him but your piece is check. There was a time when you would actually do the same thing with the rook. If you had a piece that was about to attack the rook, you would move in and you would go check rook. That was in sort of polite, I guess, 15th century Renaissance audiences. So I wanted to talk about this guy. Where do we start? Well, I think the first appearance of this is in Chaturanga, the Indian ancestor of this, when it was actually a chariot. And the pieces were actually chariot pieces. As you know, if you've played chess at all, the great thing about the rook is it can fly right across in a straight line, either vertically or horizontally, and it can wipe out anything. It can move backwards as well. We talked about the pawns so far. They can't move backwards. The rook is one of our first fellows who actually has the ability to go all over the board, anywhere he wants, and he can wipe out the enemy. So the idea was these were chariot pieces. They had incredible speed and distance to their characteristic. And in the Arabic name, actually the original Sanskrit name was Ratha, and that was then changed into the Arabic word Rukh, I guess, R-U-K-H, which also became adopted by the Italians as being Rocco, which is actually Italian for tower, which may be where this tower connection comes, but we'll get there. And eventually Rocco, Rook, it just became the name Rook. It has no bearing to the magpie crow name of similar nature in the UK and various other places. So the Rook was a chariot. How did it become a castle? In looking this up, there seems to be a few different theories behind this. The first one is that Persian chariots, which when it became Shatranj, when Chaturanga, the original Indian game, became Shatranj, the chariots remained and they were still very much used in warfare. And they say that Persian chariots, for their kind of exterior hull, were very well reinforced and maybe looked like the exterior of a building. Bit of a stretch, but okay, sure. Another possible one is that the Rocco, the tower from Italy, when the game moved into France and various sort of more Western European nations, the French called it the tower. And it may have been actually, at that time, because we're talking medieval warfare now, more akin to, say, siege towers, where you've got what looks like a building, but is on wheels and is used for scaling over castle battlements and that kind of thing. I think the one that I've heard that kind of makes the most sense to me is more symbolic than that. The rook, the chariot idea, again in medieval times when we're talking, actually chariots had kind of gone out of favor. They were probably too slow or very hard to do on European battlegrounds and stuff. And generally, the only people who were in a chariot were the king or the general or the most important person laying out the field and telling the armies where to go and do their thing. And probably the representation of the castle for the rook piece is more of an indication of its status. This is the monarch. This is our person we are fighting for. And that's why the rook is a castle piece. I like that one. All 3 or 4 theories are kind of bandied about. It does sort of explain, though, like how would a castle tower be able to move around the board the way this guy can. Let's talk a little bit about the movement of the rook. As I mentioned, it was and is still one of the most powerful pieces on the board. For those who are not too familiar with it, I'll give you a little demonstration here. So I got a rather stripped down version of the battlefield here. Got our 4 rooks, both of our kings, knight and a bishop. And I just wanted to show, like, the great thing about the rook is he can just plow right through and take any of these guys, putting the king into check. King could move out of the way, then he could take that one. I mean, it's just a really, really powerful piece. So the domain of the rook really shows off how it's got these chariot-like roots. I mean, it can move up and down, it can move right across the entire board anywhere it wants to in these giant slicing moves. And I'll show you here another example of just how potent these guys can be. And so here's an example of what the rook can do. Don't know if this would ever really happen, but for the sake of argument, you've got the hapless white king is in a bit of trouble here because this rook is now going to move into this column and put the king into check. And he can't move to the left because the other rook is already there blocking that route. The only place the king can go is over here. And that's easily solved when this rook moves here, putting him into check again. And again, the king cannot move to the left. His only option is to go to the right over here. And then unfortunately, that spells his demise because the final move for the rook can be to go into that column and put him into checkmate. Yeah, that's the rook. A really powerful piece as demonstrated there, and fascinating discussion. Also, there is something that the rook can do that is a little bit unique. I was also going to talk about this. I probably will go into more detail when I do the king, but it does have a castling feature where it and the king can swap places as forming a little bit of protection around the king. Kind of interesting. Now, I have, I think, a real soft spot for the rook for a couple of reasons that I've talked about in the very first episode of Chess Chest. On the one hand, anytime I went to visit relatives in Northern Ireland, we would often go to a place called Dundrum Castle. And as you can see here, it is almost exactly a rook chess piece out in the middle of the field. It just always struck me, that image of the giant tower. And similarly, when I was a kid, I lived in a place north sort of coastal area of British Columbia here called Alert Bay. And in visiting that place about 10 years ago, I discovered there was an arcade building there, and they had on their outside of the building carvings of a chess piece that looks like a rook to me. And so I think if you combined what those carvings there and that kind of fence-like structure are, those must have resonated with me as a child and made me think about this chess piece, this little castle piece, so that when I eventually started playing the game, I saw it and I thought, oh, right, that's that piece that is in the back of my head somehow. Yeah, so that's the rook. Very interesting guy, really powerful guy too, and has had quite an interesting personal connection for me as well. So that's the rook, and that's this episode of Chess Chess completed. Until next time, we'll see you down the rabbit hole.